Hey everyone! In this video, I'm going to do a quick little rundown of how you would write a paper 1A. I know I've already done a quick little video a couple months ago about how to write a paper 1 and paper 1A, but this time I'm actually going to walk through one with you and show you how I would write a specific response. Now, I've already went ahead and pre-planned and pre-wrote the response just for time purposes, but we'll go over my planning, my thought process, and actually go over the response I came up with throughout the recording. So first, just a couple things about paper 1. First of all, when you get to paper 1, it's going to look like this on your front cover. Remember that whether you're taking AICE Euro, AICE American, or AICE International, that you're going to have the same test book because you have the same syllabus. The only difference is the actual content, which I know is a big difference, but the actual tests for either one of the options is the same. You're going to have the same format. Paper 1's the same and paper 2's the same. It's just the content you're writing about. So first, looking at the cover of the book here, you'll see that this would just be your response booklet. Now, you'll get two booklets. One will be this booklet here, and then you'll get another one that is where you actually record your responses in. Now, one important thing here is whenever you record your responses, you'll need to write which question you're doing and which portion of the question you're doing. So I'll show you what I mean by that really quickly here. If you look here at the European option is always going to be section A in either one of the papers. But if you look over here, you'll see this 1 right here. That 1 right there tells you the question number. So if you're doing Euro, you would do 1, and then you have questions A and B here. So the way it actually looks in your response booklet is you've got 2 thin columns before you would actually write your response, where you would write question 1A or question 1B. Now, if you're doing US, you come down and you have question 2. So make sure that when you're doing writing your response that you write which question you're doing. And international is obviously question 3. Now, I'm going to do a 1A, but usually when you sit down on your test day, I've recommended for my students that they write the B first because B is worth more points, takes more time. And I think for paper 1, you really don't get enough time to actually write this paper. You could probably use about 5 to 10 minutes longer to write a really thorough, great response, but it is what it is. So always go with your higher content or higher point value questions first would be my recommendation, but we're going to do an A. So maybe in a later video, I'll walk through a B. Now, first, let's go ahead and take a look over here at the rubric. This is the rubric for a paper 1A. Paper 1A, as you can see, goes up to 4 levels here. Now, where you want to fall at for the passing range is either level 3 or level 4. Those are your points that get you into the passing range. Level 3 goes from 8 to 11 points. Level 4 goes from 12 to 15 points. So let's look at level 3 real quick here. So for 3, you have to compare the views and identify similarities and differences. Now, to get the full points here, what this says is you compare the views expressed in the sources, identify differences and similarities, and you begin to explain and evaluate the views using the sources and knowledge. Now, what this right here means, knowledge, that's your actual content knowledge. Now, one thing about paper 1, it should be the easier paper because you don't have to come in with a slew of content knowledge to be able to pass this. You can theoretically pass paper 1 if you know how to write it, at least sitting down first day in the class without any background content knowledge. As long as you can read and evaluate the sources, you can theoretically pass paper 1 without content knowledge. However, the content knowledge is what's really going to get you those extra points to get you the higher possible points. Now, another thing I want to point out that with talking about 3 is if you look at level 2 here, which is not passing, it compares views and identifies similarities and or differences. Now, so if you only talk about similarities or differences in the paper, even if you write a phenomenal paper, you're only going to get a max 7 points for it because you have to do both. And the difficult thing here, if you've been doing any practice paper 1s, is that there are definitely cases where it's really difficult to identify one or the two, where it's these two paper sources are obviously just completely different and you can't come up with anything that would be a similarity. So what you really need to think about is where the sources came from, the time period they came from, the tone, the reliability. Does anything like that? Is there anything that you can find that is similar or is different? And don't look at just what's actually written, the words written necessarily. Look at tone, audience, things of that nature can actually help you get to similarities or differences. Now, it also here, though, has the word and. So if you do compare the similarities and differences, but you do it extremely weakly and you don't have much development, you can still fall into that level too. However, if you do both and you at least explain why you think that those are similarities and differences, then you should at least fall into the lower level on level 3 and get your passing score for this section of it. Now, to get to a level 4 up here, you have to make a developed comparison. So you're going beyond just identifying the similarities and differences and how their similarities and differences. Here for a level 4, kind of think about like an overall, are the sources more similar or are they more different? Think to what extent overall do the sources agree? So kind of like the a B-level question on your paper too. To what extent? Think of it that way. If you're answering to what extent the sources agree or disagree, then you're likely to fall into this level 4 range. And just make sure that you don't just rehash what you already wrote. You have to really develop it. Let's go ahead and look over at some of these questions here. I'm going to do the American option here. Like I said, if you're taking international or Euro, it's basically the same principle. So walking through this, it should still be able to help you out with what you need to be thinking about, what you need to be doing for these ones. But I'm not going to do one for all 3. I'm just going to do one for one of them, and I'm going to pick the American option here. So our topic here up at the top, it's the American option. The American option, your paper 1 is the origins of the Civil War from 1846 to 1861. And our subtopic here, so what specifically these sources are about, are Lincoln's views on slavery. So we've got all 4 sources here, but before I even read that, I need to figure out which sources I need to look at for question A. So I come down here, and my question for A is to compare and contrast sources B and C as evidence about Lincoln's policies towards slavery after being elected president. So we're focusing on, got my 2 sources here, B and C. So it's always really important to read that because sometimes a lot of them will pop up with A and B. And if you've been doing practice ones and it's always been about A and B, you have to make sure that you're reading this because you can get any combination of 2 of the 4 sources to be what you're reading about. And then specifically, we're looking for evidence of Lincoln's policies towards slavery after being elected president. So not necessarily his personal views, but what he did as a policy as president. So we're going to come up here to source B, since that's our first one, and read over source B and find important, pertinent information in here. So source B, strictly confidential. Now, before I even read it, I'm going to look at the origin here. If you can see here, it is a letter to John Gilmer, a Whig Unionist representative from North Carolina, and it was written on December 15th, 1860. So this is where I'll use my background content knowledge here. And I know, okay, we have a Unionist representative. So this is a person who wants to see the United States stay together as a country, but he is from North Carolina. So there's a possibility here that we're looking at somebody who wants the country to stay together, but is probably a supporter of slavery. And important here is also the date. This was written December 15th, 1860. Abraham Lincoln was elected president in November of 1860. But during the time period, the period between election and inauguration day was a couple months. Lincoln wouldn't be inaugurated president until March of 1861. So this time period here is between election and becoming president. Also significant here is that it's December 15th. I know from my background content knowledge that the South would not secede from the Union, or you wouldn't have any states seceding from the Union, such as South Carolina, which was the first one, until later in the month of December. So right here, we're having obviously some upset people about the election of Lincoln, but the war has not started yet, and none of the southern states have left the Union as of now. So that's important knowledge to have going in reading source B. So let's go ahead and read over this source. Strictly confidential. Honorable John A. Gilmer. Is it desired that I shall shift the ground upon which I have been elected? I cannot do it. I have no thought of recommending the abolition of slavery in the District of Columbia, nor the slave trade among slave states. On the territorial question, I am inflexible. It is the only substantial difference between us. You think slavery is right and ought to be extended. We think it is wrong and ought to be restricted. For this, neither of us has any just occasion to be angry with the other. As to the state laws you mention, I know little of them. I have never read one. If any of them are in conflict with the Fugitive Slave Clause or any other part of the Constitution, I should be glad of their repeal. With the assurance of my highest regards, I subscribe myself your obedient servant, A. Lincoln. Okay, so some things that we're seeing in here. Remember, we're looking at his policies as he becomes president. So clearly here he has a policy of blocking the expansion of slavery into territories. However, he's also saying he is not thinking of abolishing slave trade in the District of Columbia, or not slave trade. He's not talking about abolishing slavery in the District of Columbia, and he's not discussing ending slave trade in the slave states. So the only thing he's really said he's campaigned on is that he doesn't want slavery to be expanded, but he's not trying to end it. Also here, if you notice, he's talking about some state laws. These state laws aren't specified. However, if you read down here, if any of them are in conflict with the Fugitive Slave Clause or any part of the Constitution, I should be glad of their repeal. So here, just using, once again, we're using content knowledge here. They're talking about the laws that northern states would have passed in an attempt to circumvent the Fugitive Slave Clause so they wouldn't have to send runaway slaves back down to the South. So he's arguing that he does not support these laws, though he doesn't know any of them specifically, but that he wants their repeal. So what we can go ahead and do is how I would have written some notes for myself here. All right, so for source B here, some notes I would have made for myself to jot down is that this was a private letter. It was written in December 1860. This was after Lincoln's election, but before his inauguration, and this was also before secession. Lincoln, once again, does not support abolition in D.C., does not support ending slave trade in the South, does not support the expansion of slavery, and the state laws mentioned allude to northern laws regarding fugitive slave laws, and if these are unconstitutional, Lincoln would like to see their repeal. So I have my notes there written about source B. All of these express Lincoln's policies at the time of his election. So what we're going to be looking here in source C is how they compare or contrast to Lincoln's policies at the time of his election. Now let's look at source C. So once again, what I like to do first is look at where it's coming from. This is the order of retaliation signed by Abraham Lincoln on the 30th of July, 1863. So 1863, what we know here is that this is 2 years into the American Civil War. In the month of July, Gettysburg occurred at the beginning of July. And also we know that the siege of Vicksburg ended at the beginning of July. So this is right after what would be the turning point of the war, which may or may not actually be relevant to the source in question. But it's always good to see if you can activate your content knowledge whenever you're reading information like that about the sources. So let's go ahead up and read this source. The laws of nations and the customs of war as carried on by civilized powers permit no distinction as to color in the treatment of prisoners of war. To sell or enslave any captured person on account of his color and for no offense against the laws of war is a relapse into barbarism and a crime against the civilization of the age. The government of the United States will give the same protection to all its soldiers, and if the enemy shall sell or enslave anyone because of his color, the offense shall be punished by retaliation upon enemy prisoners in our possession. It is therefore ordered that for every soldier of the United States enslaved by the enemy or sold into slavery, a rebel soldier shall be placed into hard labor on the public works and continued at such labor until the other shall be released. So essentially here, what Lincoln's saying is that if any black U.S. soldiers, Union soldiers, are forced into slavery after they've been captured by Confederate forces, then the United States military will then take any Confederate prisoners and force them into essentially involuntary servitude. So they're going to be doing hard labor, which you can imply isn't going to be paid, and that will be stopped as soon as the U.S. soldiers that were enslaved are released. So Lincoln's basically here, what he's arguing is that if you enslave our soldiers because of their color, then we will essentially, in a way, enslave your prisoners in retaliation of it, which is why this is called the Order of Retaliation. So let's take a look at my notes that I've written here. Okay, so we have source C. This is an executive order. It was written in July of 1863. This is 2 years into the war. Lincoln here clearly wants all Union soldiers to be treated as soldiers when they are captured. And he argues that if any are put into slavery, then captured Confederates will be forced into manual labor as well, which is involuntary servitude. So we have our two sources here, which definitely show differences here. But we're doing compare and contrast. So let's write this out and think of this in a easy way to determine overall, do these sources, are they more similar or are they more different? All right, so I quickly here made this little chart. Now, obviously you don't have time on this paper to do everything the exact way I do. So when you're reading them, these sources, I would underline things and make little notes on the side, because remember, you can write all over these tests. And then on my actual response booklet, I would probably draw a chart like this. One important note, whatever you write in your response booklet, it will be scanned, and the people reading your exam to score it will read every single word. So right here, if you draw this little chart out, even though it's for your personal notes, this can help you get points on your AICE exam, because it'll help show that you know what you're talking about, or they'll be able to see what you're getting at. No, you're not going to pass simply writing this, but this could help you get maybe a 1 point here or there. Now, okay, so for differences in the sources, we have one is a private letter versus a public order. Lincoln's position is clearly changed in these sources. And we also have that one is during a time of peace opposed to the wartime. Similarities, Lincoln's arguments in both of these sources are based on the law. For instance, he brings up the Constitution in B when he's talking about fugitive slave laws. And in source C, he's talking about the laws of nations, or law of nations in C. And that might seem like a stretch, but those are things he specifically mentions in both of the sources. So either way, his policies are based on law. Lincoln is also opposed to slavery clearly in both of these sources. However, he is not necessarily a supporter of abolition. He is not calling in either one for the abolition of slavery. And you can also argue that both of these sources are reliable, because both of these come from Abraham Lincoln and clearly show his opinions and expression on policies regarding the question of slavery during his time as president and right after his election. All right, so now that we have looked at all of these, I went ahead and wrote out my response. I'm going to make this bigger here, make it a little bit easier for you guys to read. All right, so now that we have looked at both of the sources, we've taken our notes, we've highlighted the differences and the similarities, it's time to actually write out our response. Now, up at the top here, I actually rewrote the question. You absolutely 100% do not have to do that. And also remember, for any of the history papers, do not write an introduction. If you want to write an introductory statement just to help guide you, that's fine. Do not write an introductory paragraph, and do not write a concluding paragraph. You do not have time for it. It's completely unnecessary. You won't get any points for it. So I know that's kind of in opposition to what you've been told for other writing classes, but do not write an introductory paragraph. Do not write a concluding paragraph. Get to the point. So once again, to rehash, our question was compare and contrast sources B and C as evidence about Lincoln's policies towards slavery after being elected president. So this is my response here. Sources B and C provide evidence that Lincoln's policies towards slavery changed after he was elected president. Both sources were written by Lincoln and provide a reliable depiction of how Lincoln's views changed. Source B was a private letter written in December 1860 to a pro-slavery Unionist from North Carolina. In early December 1860, Lincoln had been elected but not yet inaugurated as president. Additionally, Southern states had not yet begun to secede from the Union. In this letter, Lincoln states that he does not support abolition in D.C. or ending the slave trade in the South. It is apparent Gilmer has shown concerns over Northern laws aimed at curtailing the Fugitive Slave Act, to which Lincoln responds that if these laws violate the Constitution, he wishes to see their end. Source C, however, is a public executive order written 2 years into the Civil War. In Source C, Lincoln expresses that he wants captured Union black soldiers to be treated the same as the white soldiers. If black soldiers are forced into slavery, then captured white Confederate soldiers are to be forced into involuntary servitude. In both B and C, Lincoln uses legal arguments to support his position. In Source B, Lincoln utilizes the Constitution, while in Source C, he refers to the laws of war. Furthermore, in both sources, it is clear Lincoln opposes slavery but does not necessarily promote abolitionist policies. Overall, B and C show a shift in Lincoln's policies towards slavery. Although it is clear in both sources that Lincoln opposed slavery on principle, the circumstances of the time when the sources were written required an alteration in actual policies. Source B was written during a time of peace, while Source C was written during a time of war. The demands of the Civil War and Lincoln's need to win the war and reunite the country required flexibility in policy. Okay, so some of the things you can see I did here. I provided direct evidence from the sources in both cases. I supported my statement when I said Lincoln felt a certain way. I backed it up with direct evidence from the sources while not giving a direct rehash of each one of the sources. Let's see. For disagreement, here at source B and C, I clearly state that his arguments have changed, where Lincoln is clearly willing to what would essentially be force white Confederate soldiers into slavery in response to black Union soldiers being forced into slavery. That is clearly not something that December 1860 Abraham Lincoln would have supported, and that's kind of clear to tell. But at the top, when he's talking about he doesn't support abolition, he's not supporting ending the slave trade, but he doesn't want it to expand. Here you can argue it's kind of like an expansion, but you don't actually have to write that. It's kind of implied in what you're saying. Now for similarities, Lincoln uses legal arguments to support his position. Lincoln clearly utilized the Constitution in Source B, so I've stated how he used the legal argument in B. It was the Constitution. And in Source C, as you can see here, laws of war, I have in quotes because that's the wording he used in Source C to show that this is a legal argument. Now, as you can tell, I've kind of made my point up in the top two paragraphs that overall Lincoln's policies did change. However, I'm doing that little third paragraph to kind of push my argument more towards that level 4 range. So here I have the overall B and C show a shift in policies towards slavery, but I'm not simply rehashing what I stated in that first paragraph. I'm pointing out not necessarily new evidence, but I'm saying he had to change his policies because of the circumstances were written. So I have like B was written during a time of peace, or C was written during a time of war, and the demands of war required that Lincoln change his policies. So clearly I'm not just saying, yeah, they're different, and this is how they're different, and yeah, they have similarities, and this is how they're similar. I'm showing why it's important that his policy shifted and how they did. That would really kind of push that from a level 3 up into the level 4 range. So am I saying this is a 15 points on the rubric? Probably not. I don't really think they give that, but I'm saying that if you had this question with these sources and you were to write a response like this, you've most definitely passed your paper 1A. And if you follow those same procedures of comparing and contrasting, taking some notes, make yourself that little chart. Maybe you can do that while you fill in your little differences and similarities chart as you're actually reading the sources, and you knock this out, then you should be well on your way of getting the passing score on the rubric for a paper 1A.